It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. An analytics team had just completed what they thought was a fantastic single slide summary of a study that had just been completed. The challenge, though, was that they needed to communicate it to two very different audiences. And by trying to do it all at once, they actually missed the mark on both. That is the plot of the story I'm going to tell you today. It's a true story, of course, with names and numbers changed to preserve confidentiality. So we'll come back to that soon. Before we do, though, I want to start with a question. Who are you communicating to? Now, this sounds simple, right? Sounds like something obvious that we should be thinking about when we are communicating. But too often, we totally skip this step. We finish our project or analysis and we jump straight to making graphs and slides, maybe without giving any thought to the people on the receiving ends of those materials. This is a missed opportunity. When we start by thinking about this question, who we're communicating to, we can tailor things to them, right? Because we can think about things like who are they? What motivates them? What are their needs? And if we can meet those needs, we can get our own needs met as well. Now, it turns out there are a ton of different aspects of our communication that we can tailor for our audience. From the general approach we take, to the materials we develop, to the environment in which we present. Let's get a little bit more specific here. When it comes to the general approach, we can think about things like how does our audience want to be communicated to? Are we going to be meeting with them in person? Are we sending an email and they need to go through things on their own? What's a good amount of time to plan for? Are we going to have a limited attention span on the part of our audience, or they're patient and interested in what we're communicating, are going to want a deep dive? How should we best frame the conversation? Do we lead with the so what, or do we need to build up to it? Let's think about how we can tailor our materials. One thing to think about is how formal do things need to be? Do we need a polished presentation, or will a casual conversation better suit? How will we be sharing the information? Projecting it up on a slide in a tiny box in virtual land, the way you see me here, maybe a static handout in some cases. What level of detail will your audience crave? Do they want you to stick to the big picture or get into the nitty gritty? What are their feelings towards or comfort level with data and graphs? Do you need to keep things basic and easy, or is complex okay? Sometimes we even have control over aspects related to the environment in which we communicate. Things like where should we meet, right? Do you go to their office? Do they come to yours? Do you meet in a conference room or go for a walk? If you're doing a virtual session, what's their preferred technology? What time of day is best? Should you include other people or go at it on your own? And these are just a few aspects we can tailor. Now, we won't always have control over all of these things, but it makes sense to optimize for those that we do, particularly when the stakes are high. It's going to be worth it to take some time and energy to meet your audience's needs so you can get their attention, help build understanding, and ultimately drive them to action. Let's take a look at a specific example next. All right, we're going to be back to our story. In a moment, I'm going to put some text up on the screen. I'm going to have you read through it, and then we'll talk about it. Go ahead and take a moment to read through this. All right, so we see here that Universa just completed a study for their new anti anxiety medication, Serentiva. And they've found the great results that consumer preference seems to be strongly for Serentiva. So they are getting ready to communicate these results. Have already started doing so in some cases. Let me show you next the slide they created. It looked like this. I'm going to give you a moment to take this in. And as you study it, please note what was executed well, as well as any points of potential confusion. I'll give you just about 20 seconds here. So now that you've taken some time to grapple with this graph, let me walk you through my process for doing so. So, the first thing I do when faced with an unfamiliar visual is look for clues about where I'm meant to look. And when I look there, what I'm meant to see. Next, I'll often read through everything, any titles, annotations. In the case where we have multiple graphs, like we do here, I also want to get an understanding of how the different views or different visuals or different data fits together. So in this case, if we start by looking for clues of where to look, somebody was thoughtful here and made it very clear where to look with those pink outlines. So when I look at the data in the pink outlines, I see bars, and they all look about the same length. If I just bounce back and forth between the left graph and the right graph, I see they're for different reasons, although anxiety relief is consistent across both. Then I observe that the bar for anxiety relief on the upper left is a little bit smaller than the bar for anxiety relief on the bottom right. Now is when I start reading things. Actually, this is where things get a little confusing because the things I read actually run counter to some of the observations I just made. So if we start at the top left, we see that that graph represents those who expressed preference for Serentiva. There were 70 people who fit in that group. On the bottom right are those who expressed preference for the competitor product, with 19 people in that group. So now, if I take these numbers in account together with the percents, it's a little bit different story or takeaway than I originally articulated there. So that's something we'll want to revisit. Next, I want to understand how that bottom graph fits in with everything. And after some studying and some bouncing back and forth between the views, I can see that actually another way of summarizing that 70 and 19, right? The people in our study. So there's a little bit of redundancy here, though there also is some new information because it's first in that bottom graph that I can see there was also a portion of the study population who didn't express a preference either way. So I want to figure out how to tie that all together a little more seamlessly. But before we jump into changes to make, let's think back to that question that we began with. Who are you communicating to? Now, one of the nuances in this particular case was that the immediate audience was not the ultimate audience. In fact, the team had to use two different intermediary audiences to do the real communicating, arming them both with an understanding of the study and presentation materials to subsequently be able to tell that story to their eventual audiences. This was further complicated by the fact that the way these two audiences were communicating was very different. First audience were psychiatrist speakers. These are physicians employed by Universa to speak on behalf of the company and their products at industry events. So the big goal that they had in doing so was to try to influence their peers, right? The psychiatrists in the audience at these industry events to prescribe Serentiva. And the way that they would do so is typically over lunch or dinner. The presenter, the physician speaker, would be up on stage, big screen behind them with a podium in front of them. And so they had the benefit of being able to use slides and walk through those, but the constraint of being competing for attention with food and dinner conversation and networking. Very different scenario for the second audience. And this was Universe's own sales representatives who were calling on doctors in their offices. So their goal was to get the doctors that they called on to want to write Serentiva prescriptions. And the way they would be doing that is actually in the doctor's office during the business day with a static detail piece, right? A handout to try to talk the doctor through. And the biggest constraint they faced was time. Only got a limited number of minutes of the doctor's attention before they needed to move on to something else. So let's take a look now at that original slide with these audiences in mind. Given what we know about them, this actually isn't optimized for either of those scenarios, right? It's too dense to put up on a big screen and try to talk through it eloquently. And at the same time, there's some confusing things going on that are going to make it difficult to talk through in a live setting with a doctor in their office. So we took a different approach, two different approaches, actually. For the psychiatrists at the industry events, we thought a novel approach could actually work pretty well here. And that was for a couple of reasons. So first off, we decided that we really wanted to reinforce that the study wasn't made up of data. Rather, the study was composed of patients, people. And so we made the decision to want to encode each of those people directly, not aggregate them into a bar, for example. We also wanted to do something eye-catching and thought that a less familiar graph might help achieve this. Also, there's the added benefit of presentation on a slide where we could build things piece by piece so that though less common, the view of the data would feel intuitive because of this piecewise building. As an additional bonus there, we thought the sense of anticipation, right, intrigue that it would build as we revealed things slowly might help us maintain our audience's interest and attention for the duration of the short presentation. Here is what that looked like. I'm here to talk with you today about patients' overwhelming preference for Universe's new anti-anxiety drug, Serentiva. Let me walk you through the results of our latest study. So if you start by considering a square, let's imagine that a single square represents a patient in our study. Overall, we had 99 patients participate. First, we asked a simple question: which anti-anxiety drug do you prefer? 10 people didn't have a preference either way. 70 people preferred Serentiva, and the remaining 19 people expressed preference for the competitor. But we wanted to dig deeper. So next, we asked, what drives your preference? And what I'll show next are the primary reasons reported by participants. Of the 70 who preferred Serentiva, 34 cited lack of mood swings as the primary reason for that preference. Another 29 said it was due to better anxiety relief, and 7 people stated their preference was due to other reasons. If we shift over to the 19 who preferred the competitor's product, 8 people stated a preference 4 mood swings. This was sort of an unexpected finding that we're not entirely sure how to interpret. But 8 people cited anxiety relief, and that final few said their preference was due to other reasons. So, just to quickly summarize, we had 99 in our study, and the overwhelming majority, more than 70%, expressed preference for Universa's new product, Serentiva. Right, here's the breakdown I just showed you, all those reasons put together. I'm going to go ahead and leave this up on the screen while I address your questions. So at the end of the short presentation, this final summary slide would stay up on the screen during Q&A, giving the psychiatrist audience a comprehensive overview of the results that were just shared. This was also printed and provided with additional materials to attending physicians on Serentiva, so that they had a reminder of what was covered. Now, while this final slide makes perfect sense as part of the progression in a live presentation, we feared, given the novelty of the approach and just the density of stuff going on visually here, that it might be confusing as a standalone. So rather than repurpose it for the sales team, we decided to take a different approach there. Now, as we discussed, when salespeople call on doctors' offices, typically the biggest constraint they face is time. The physicians are likely to only spend a couple of minutes with them to hear their spiel. So, given this, we didn't want them to have to spend any time really talking about how to read the graphs. So by simplifying as much as possible, we could get the conversation going and focus more quickly on the results of study outcome and findings. Now, the original slide achieved this to some degree, right? It only used bar charts, a very familiar graph type. But part of the confusion here is this initial version includes percents of different totals. And so these were difficult to quickly reconcile and also could easily lead to people making or false comparisons or observations. So we wanted to preserve the simplicity, but tie it all together in a way that was easier to interpret. Here is what the revamped slide looked like. We did a few things. We put the primary takeaway into words, right? Note at the top there, lack of mood swings and anxiety relief drive Serentiva preference. We turned the most important summary data points into simple numbers. 70.70% expressed preference for Serentiva, compared to only 19.2% for the competitor product. We included a single graph and focused it on the number of patients so that people could both see the varying distribution across the reasons for preference, but also clear differences in the scale of numbers between the preference for Serentiva compared to the competitor. It turns out that this was an efficacious approach of shifting from showing data to really telling a data-driven story. Shortly after starting to socialize and use the new materials, the team shared a number of positive developments with me. They were noting that they were having smarter questions and better conversations, both the psychiatrist speakers and the salespeople, with the ultimate psychologists on whom they were calling. But perhaps a better indicator than any of this anecdotal evidence was the immediate increase that Universa saw in Serentiva prescriptions. So this is a great example, right, of coming back to that first question that we started off here today, of being thoughtful about our audience and their needs, really designing our communication with those needs top of mind. In doing so, we were able to turn a confusing slide into 2 targeted resources that afforded understanding and drove action. Now, I know we have some related questions to get to momentarily, but before we do, I want to share a couple of resources related to the content that we went through here today. So the case study I just took you through is actually one that I contributed to Steve Wexler's latest book, The Big Picture. And actually, the chapter on case studies, I think, is my favorite in the book because it's such a great assembly of different industries and different graphs and different ways to use data to really drive decision making in a business setting, which is really the core focus of the book. If you'd like to hear more about the book and more from Steve, you can do so through the live podcast that I did with him back in May 2021, shortly after his book was officially released. You can watch that. You'll find it in the videos section in the community. Or if you'd prefer to listen, it's also recorded and posted for audio as episode 44 of the Storytelling with Data podcast. There is also an exercise related to the example we just went through here today. So if you found yourself at any point thinking, all right, I get that, but I would have approached that a little differently, here's your place to show us how you would have done it. So you can take the same starting point that I did today and then pick your audience, either your psychiatrist speakers or the sales reps, and optimize a communication that's going to meet their needs. Ton of other exercises in the community and other resources as well. And with that, I think we'll take a couple minutes to address some related questions.
Hey, Cole. So we have a question that we received that was talking about, and kind of interesting given we had some technical difficulties, but a question was about what do you do if you keep getting interrupted during your presentation?
Interruptions during a presentation. So this is challenging. And again, I think coming back to who you're communicating to, right? Who is the person who's interrupting you? Is it someone in a senior leadership position? And so you maybe kind of have to let them steer the conversation? Or is it a peer who you may be able to get to control themselves and behave differently? I think in the case of the former, right? If it's someone who is influential or where it would for some reason be not the right approach to say, no, I'll get to that, but I want to get through my content first, right? Sometimes you can do that. In some cases, that is absolutely not going to be the right approach. It really depends on your relationship with the person and sort of where you are respectively in the organization. So then you want to think about what's driving that, right? What are they after when they're doing it? And do you need to organize what you're going to present or how you're going to present it, knowing that that's going to happen and being prepared to deal with it? Right. And one way to do so could be you come armed with your deck, but instead of launching into the spiel, you start by saying, you call on the person in the audience. I know you're going to have questions. Do you want us to go through the planned presentation, or do you want to start there so that we can get you satisfied right before we go through? Or if it's the case where it's someone just sort of peppering questions and it's not helpful and they're not in a position where you need to cater to that, then you want to see how you might be able to help change that behavior. If appropriate, you might take the person outside of the meeting and talk to them about what that does to your presentation. Or if that doesn't make sense, then maybe having someone who would be influential to them, who's friendly to you, who might be able to help navigate that. Those are just some ideas. That's actually a question I've never received before, which I always enjoy those, I think, the most. So thank you for that.
Maybe a bit of a follow-up on that. Do you have any other tips that have worked on the idea of interruption, but not only interruption, but specifically to wanting to just jump ahead to the conclusion? Let's just go to the head to this slide. Like they don't want to see you walk them through that journey. Any other things that have worked well for you?
Yeah, this is another good one. And I would say if you can, so ideally you can anticipate that ahead of time, right? Because as we think about who our audience is, how we're going to be presenting to them, one of the things that we want to think through is how are we going to organize our content and the order in which we go through things. And now, if you can anticipate that your audience is going to want you to address, so what, right? Why are we here? What's your point? Why should we listen to you? Do it up front so that they're not antsy the whole time waiting for you to get to it, or they're not interrupting you over the course of the process. So if you do that, then you can plan everything with that structure, right? Where you can start with that big idea, the so what. And then if your audience agrees with you there, you may not even have to go through all the rest. Or you can have them help dictate, given that, where do you go from there? And then when you design your materials, you'd want to do so more with the idea of a choose your own adventure sort of setup than a prescribed story that goes smoothly from beginning to end. Because if you design that for the audience who wants to change the course, it's going to be frustrating for everyone. So the more you can anticipate that and then try to build materials that will help you navigate and respond to that thoughtfully, the better everyone's going to feel about things. And the more likely you are to get people to understand and hopefully take the action that's needed or have a good discussion.
All right. So you highlight a lot of the simplicity and clarity and keeping things very almost obvious. And don't we risk creating this sense of we didn't do thorough research, we actually didn't spend a lot of time doing our homework, or we're talking down to them because we're making it so simple? Isn't that a potential outcome of keeping things simple?
So, simple as a goal is, I think, always something that we should strive for. And it's not about oversimplifying, right? Or dumbing things down. That is not the reason we do this. It's about not making things more complicated than they need to be. And we have a tendency to make things more complicated than they need to be. Because for us, right, the one putting together the graph or the analysis, we know it really well. So for us, it's not complicated. And that's not because we're smarter than our audience, it's because we're more familiar with what we're going to be communicating. So this, again, is not about dumbing anything down. It's about presenting the context and the findings in a way where everyone's going to be on equal footing because you've let them know all of the sort of tacit details that are in your head, or at least the ones that they need to be able to understand and take action with what you're presenting. And so, on the question of robustness, right, when we simplify, does that undermine the complicated things we did? Not if approached smartly. And so, if you can anticipate, or if this is a big divergence from how things culturally have been at the organization, then you don't want to go from a big, dense report to a simple presentation, right? People will push against that, they'll reject it because it's different. Rather, you can think about how might I take steps in that direction, or how could I pair those two things? Right? So you could start by maybe you do the dense deck that you would have done. But what if you put a section at the beginning where you can say, we did the thorough, deep analysis like we always do. It's there. We are happy to walk you through it. But actually, before we do so, and to help set context, we want to take you through the meta story, right? The big picture. It's only going to take us 5 or 10 minutes. But at the end of that, you'll have the 30,000-foot view. And from there, we can dive into whatever details you need to. Right? So it's all about thinking about the scenario, right? Who you're presenting to, as we talked about here today. What roadblocks or constraints can you anticipate? What challenges are going to come up? And how can you make it so? Instead of trying to react on the fly in the moment to those challenges, you've thought about them ahead of time and actually formed your materials and your presentation to take those into account and be able to deal with them seamlessly. This is a fantastic way of really demonstrating to our audience that we're not doing this for us, right? It's not a selfish thing. We are doing it for them because we think we can use data to help them understand something better or do something smarter. And you want to see it always as a partnership between you and your audience, not this us versus them, right? Not they ask me questions and I get off track, but rather, okay, if that's happening, how can I change my approach so that what I give them works with their needs. And it takes time, takes thought. Find small things you can do that will help you along that path, because that will build positive momentum.
All right. Next question is there a standard guideline on the number of slides to use, or how much of our slides should be words versus how much should be graphs or pictures? And then there's a follow-up question to that as well.
The answer to that is no. Do you want to do the follow-up now, or should I expound? So there's not a magic number, right? And it's because of a lot of the things that we've talked about today. Every situation is going to be a little bit different, right? I think of it like a puzzle. And you've got lots of different pieces to this puzzle. There is who you're communicating to, how you're doing it, right? What the data says. Does it reinforce something people thought, or is it going to challenge preconceived notions? Are you accessing technology? Is that technology likely to go smoothly, or will there be hiccups that you'll have to deal with? Right? All of these things, and those are just a few factors. But these all mean that every time we communicate, it's going to be a little bit different. And that means there's no one approach that's going to magically work across all of these diverse scenarios. Now, some people find that annoying. I actually think that is the reason that this space is so fun. Right? It's impossible to get bored because you're never dealing with exactly the same thing. So see that as opportunity, and really anything you do as part of your planning process when it comes to creating materials or focusing on yourself as you become adept at presenting those materials, right? Or helping others who might be presenting the materials that you're creating. The more time and attention you give to those pieces, the better your communicating is going to be for everyone.
The follow-up question was to get your thoughts on pitch decks, which are very commonly stripped down. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that's taking the scenario into account, right? When you're pitching, it's typically to an audience who's going to have limited time and attention span. See a lot of other people pitching as well. So you always want to be thinking about, how do you optimize? And I feel like a broken record here, but the more we do this, really, the more successful we'll be in any scenario. But optimize for the given situation. Optimize your materials, optimize your approach, right? And I'll actually use this as a point to end on, because really a lot of it means coming back to the question that we started with here today. And this is one that I highly encourage you to reflect on the next time you find yourself communicating with data. Who are you communicating to? How can you optimize your materials and your approach with your audience in mind? When we do that, we have a better chance of getting their attention, delivering understanding, and driving action. With that, I'm going to say thanks very much for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.